Well, thank you, Michael, for this great introduction to Aconcagua. We go very high now, and yesterday we have talked about these extreme altitudes. How do we cope with it? What can go wrong? And of course, the main thing we have heard from Eduardo is really acclimatization. We need to get our bodies accustomed to this altitude. And the question, of course, and you have mentioned, and Urs has also mentioned before, can we do something before we go to high altitude to pre-acclimatize? Can we do something that we can already start this process of adaptation so that when we go to high altitude, we're already prepared and we already have maybe part of this process that has been completed. And we have heard from Eduardo. Of course, you could go in a hypobaric chamber. It's very cumbersome, it's very technically demanding to decrease the pressure in a chamber, so it's not feasible for anyone to do this. But there is another way. And this is called intermittent exposure to normobaric hypoxia. We get into what exactly we can technically do to do this. The big question, of course, is what are the effects on the body when we do that? And there is some previous data. I will not go into the details. We can use the time in the water purification workshop if you want to discuss a little bit about this, the data that exists and what the protocols that we can use. So there is a bit of data showing, some studies, they show actually a decrease in AMS incidence when people do that with different protocols. But what is really unknown, and that's one of the key points, is the physiological response. I mean, of course, you can do a study where you put people in the intermittent normobaric hypoxia and then people that you don't do and compare the AMS incidence when they go at high altitude for real. But does really the process of adaptation happen in the same way when we do that to when we go to high altitude? This is the question, and it has been largely unanswered. So those protocols, you see here an example from one of the studies that we did at the URAC. This is a huge hypobaric chamber in Bolzano, Italy, very nice facility. And you see here that people sleep in hypoxic conditions at night. And what you see here is basically a simulated altitude that is provided by decreasing the oxygen concentration in the air in the tent while you sleep. And you see you do that every night. You can go higher and higher, adapt to different altitudes. And then during the day, you of course get out of this tent, you live your day in normal altitude and you have more oxygen available. So that's the intermittent part of it. So you only have it at night. And we know from the studies, you need a lot of exposure. Otherwise, you cannot expect an effect, of course. So 120, even 200 hours of total exposure is necessary, we think. And this means you certainly have to go to do this for about 4 weeks before you start. But how can we do this technically? This is, I also don't go into the details here, but I was, of course, interested, how does it work? I did some research, and we have some engineers in this room that could much better explain this, probably. But the component with a different affinity. So if you do that, and then this compound will mostly trap the oxygen, the CO2 and the noble gases in the air, but not the nitrogen. So the nitrogen will escape, and then you have an increased concentration of nitrogen in this air that escapes. And you can lead that into a tent where you are sleeping. Looks like this. There are different models available. This is the one I used. Urs mentioned briefly that we did a study last year with, to really see what is the physiological effect of this. So I was using this tent for 4 weeks. And there is this nitrogen concentrator, is really loud, so you don't want to have it in the same room, otherwise you cannot sleep at all. So maybe that's also a bit of a confounder in the whole story. And then the air, the nitrogen, concentrated nitrogen is led into the tent with a tube, and you basically can select the amount of hypoxia that you have during the night. So it's quite a simple procedure, but you can imagine You give this tent to the people that want to go to the mountain. They have a small knob to set the amount of hypoxia. There is no monitoring. There is nothing. They do that at home. They might be older people with cardiovascular disease. Maybe that's not such a good idea, right? And there is really no data about the safety of this. There is no data about the physiological effects. So that's why we are not that sure how to use it and if it's a good idea to tell everyone to use it. So that's the basic thing. So the studies we see, we mentioned briefly, 2 studies from France and from Austria. They show reduction of AMS incidence. But other studies are inconclusive, or they basically don't show an effect. So it's not really sure. And the feasibility and safety, as we said, is really not studied enough. And then, do the physiological adaptations happen or not? We don't know. An expedition is very complex. It's not just adaptation that makes the decision if an expedition goes wrong or if it does not go wrong. And I don't mean if you can summit or not, but also if something happens or not. So if you enable people to perform better, do they take more risks? We have discussed this yesterday. So those are all factors that I think should be studied more deeply. And nevertheless, and you know that very well, in Nepal, the expedition, the commercial expeditions to Everest, for example, you can book expedition to Everest in 8 weeks, standard protocol, for 50,000 euros if you book with all the luxury that's available. But then, of course, you can book for 90,000 euro in 3 weeks, 21 days, and they say, you know, you go into this tent, and then we provide you Everest in 3 weeks. It just is double the amount of money. So basically, the commercial exploitation of this is already in full force. So the people are giving this possibility, and they are basically selling it as something that we know already exactly how it works, and we don't really know enough. But basically, I'm sure that providing hypoxia, of course, will trigger those mechanisms. But we, I think, need to answer those few remaining questions. And this is the reason that the Medical Commission of the UIAA has in 2020 come out with this position paper just to ask these questions, just to say, well, obviously it's in use, obviously it's promising, but we need to get more data. That was basically the thing that we said in this here. And that was also, I will quickly tell you about the project we had that came out of this, because we then said, well, it will be worth to provide some data in this area. And we organized with URS an expedition to Nepal, where we measured the physiological response in the adaptation of the microcirculation. We had some insight yesterday about this, because really where the adaptation happens to increase oxygen extraction capacity in the tissue is not in the blood pressure or in the stroke volume of the heart, but it's in how the capillaries distribute the red blood cells in the tissue. So that's what we measured. And we had then a randomization of people that went into the tent for pre-acclimatization and people that didn't do that. And we had this protocol, 4 weeks, 28 days, of increasing hypoxia in the tent before we went there. We saw this yesterday. This is where the magic happens during adaptation, and this is basically how we can measure it. It's a dark field microscope. It's a portable device that will, here is an example from the sublingual area, where you place these microscopes, non-invasive, and then you can see the individual red blood cells that move through the capillaries. And that's how we can quantify what happens in the tissue with the red blood cell distribution. And this is not for the details, but we have algorithms that detect the capillaries. And then we can detect the red blood cell positions in those capillaries, and we can measure what is the vessel density of capillaries in the tissue, and how fast are those red blood cells moving. And together, this means this is tissue perfusion. So we can measure tissue perfusion, and we have shown that this increases at high altitude. That was our previous expedition. that we did to Himlung Himal in Nepal. We just measured this in people going up to 7,200 meters. And this is the way the body increases oxygen extraction capacity, by increasing total vessel density. That's the density of the capillaries in the organs that goes up. And it's not that those capillaries are all built new, but it's not a secret that all of us, we have more capillaries than are currently in use when we are here at rest. And we showed that this is the amount of capillaries that was recruited. So pre-existing capillaries, reserve capacity that was recruited so that people can adapt to live at 7,000 meters or to exist at 7,000 meters. This is how it looks, and basically we showed that at sea level, the amount of capillaries that can be recruited was equal to the amount that was recruited at 6,000 meters in that study. So that's how we went into this new project, and what we wanted to show is, does this physiologic adaptation, the recruitment of the capillaries, does it happen also in the nitrogen tent before we go to high altitudes? That would be a very good indication that the physiology actually works, and that's how we did the randomization. So we did examinations in Bern, in Switzerland. We randomized standard preparations, people going into the tent, and then we went to Nepal, to Mera Peak, and Damadablam was our goal, so also 7,000 meters. It's exactly like Aconcagua, so we could probably just take the results and apply them to Aconcagua. And this was the protocol to go into the study in Nepal. And if you like to have more details about this, we use the workshop to have some discussion.